Most people simply don't have an intuitive grasp of probability and risk, and this mathematical blind spot makes them incredibly vulnerable to misleading statistics about vaccine safety. Let me give you the tools to understand what numbers actually mean when you encounter health information. First, you need to understand baseline rates. Cancer is common. In the United States alone, roughly 1.9 million new cancer cases are diagnosed every year. That's about 5,200 new diagnoses every single day, week after week, year after year, regardless of vaccination status or any other variable. When you vaccinate hundreds of millions of people, enormous numbers of them will inevitably be diagnosed with cancer in the weeks and months after vaccination simply because cancer diagnoses are constant background events. Here's a concrete example. Let's say 333 cancer cases are reported after billions of vaccine doses. That sounds alarming at first, doesn't it? But let's do the actual math. If you vaccinate 200 million people and track them for a year, how many cancer diagnoses would you expect based purely on baseline rates? The answer is roughly 3.8 million new cancer diagnoses, because that's the normal cancer incidence rate in a population that size. So 333 cases isn't evidence of increased cancer risk. It's actually far below what you'd expect to see by pure chance. This is where understanding denominators becomes critical. Out of how many total people did these events occur? A number that sounds large in absolute terms might be tiny in relative terms. 1,000 adverse events sounds scary until you realize it's 1,000 out of 500 million doses, which is 0.0002%. Now let's talk about framing effects. The way information is presented dramatically affects how we perceive risk, even when the underlying numbers are identical. 333 cancers after vaccination triggers alarm. Cancer rate of 0.000017% in vaccinated population, well below expected baseline, is the same information but doesn't spread virally on social media. You also need to understand the difference between relative risk and absolute risk. Imagine a study finds vaccination doubles your risk of some extremely rare condition. That sounds terrifying. But if the baseline risk is 1 in 10 million and doubling it means 2 in 10 million, the absolute risk increase is essentially negligible even though the relative risk doubled. Here's a practical framework for evaluating risk claims. First, always ask, compared to what? Risk doesn't exist in a vacuum. What's the baseline rate without the intervention? Second, what's the absolute number, not just the relative change? Third, what are the alternative risks? If vaccines carried some tiny theoretical risk but prevented much larger risks from the diseases they protect against, the choice is clear. Natural frequency formats help most people understand probability better than percentages. 1 in 10,000 people is more intuitive than 0.01% for most of us. When you encounter percentage-based risk claims, try converting them to natural frequencies to get better intuitive sense of the actual magnitude. Risk comparison also helps. What's the risk from the vaccine compared to the risk from the disease it prevents? Compared to everyday activities we don't think twice about, you're statistically far more likely to die in a car accident driving to get vaccinated than from the vaccine itself. Yet most people don't experience paralyzing fear about routine car trips. There's also something called Simpson's paradox, where patterns that appear in aggregated data reverse when you break the data down by subgroups or vice versa. This shows how statistics can be genuinely counterintuitive and why superficial analysis of numbers can lead to completely wrong conclusions. The bottom line is this: when someone throws scary-sounding numbers at you about vaccine risks, pause and ask these questions. What's the denominator? What's the baseline rate? What's the absolute versus relative risk? Compared to what alternatives? Without answers to those questions, you're reacting emotionally to numbers stripped of essential context.